Hello and welcome to Board Now's Cult Television Reviews, and on this video I will be reviewing episode 4 of the first season of Euphoria, the HBO teen series, and this episode is called Shook 1 Part 2. And before I start discussing the episode, just to say sorry for this being put up a bit late. I had to catch up with the repeat tonight. It's Sunday, so yeah, this is going up a bit later. Normally I would have it up pretty much the same day it airs in the UK, so next week should be back to normal. I should have it up on the Tuesday/early Wednesday morning. So, you might remember I had mixed feelings on the last episode, and I felt it was probably the weakest of the three up to that point. And I have to say this continues the downward trend. I mean, the last episode there was still plenty of solid stuff, and it certainly had a powerful ending. But this one is really starting to lose it a bit, and I feel it could be just one of those mid-season things because we're now halfway through this season. There's 8 episodes. So it could be one of those where it's just, spinning the wheels a bit, taking its time, and then gonna really hit top gear for the rest of the season after this. But yeah, it was a weird episode. This was the first one I felt where it really started to feel like stuff was happening just for the sake of it. There was a lot of repetition, and it's a weird one as in a lot was happening, but it was repetitive stuff really, and it just felt forced. It felt just for shock factor, and it as I said, it was all very similar stuff. It wasn't really stuff that was moving the plot forward or the characters forward. And yeah, it did feel for the first time really then it was very shallow sort of team kind of melodrama. But I'll talk more about it because the majority of the episode is set at a fairground where all the characters are, and it's kind of this thing of all their plots sort of colliding and things coming together and certain reveals coming out. So I'll talk more about that. The episode starts with another sort of flashback. So obviously at the start of last episode we got Kat's sort of past and background, and this time they're doing it with Jules. So Jules is sort of the main focus of this episode, and I think that's quite a good idea to have a flashback for each character at the start of the episodes, certainly like some of the main ones. But with Jules in this one, it didn't really grab me as much as Kat's flashback in the last one. So the setup is that we see her being taken to like a mental institution as a kid by her mum, and she's basically only 11, and it turns out to be a bit of a trick on her because she's told they're there to sort of have a look around the facilities, and she has a nice conversation with the doctor who she seems to bond with, but she's being shown around, and you get a shot of the mother talking to the doctor on the other side of the door. And it's quite a well shot scene because it's all from Jules's perspective, so you're inside the thing with her, so it then yeah, you see that reaction from her where, as I said, the mother and the doctor are on the other side of the door, and things slowly dawn on Jules, and it's a trick, and that she's actually there to stay, not just for a visit. But again, it really hits these heavy sort of beats. So she's in there, and there's this really, really sort of gross, disturbed patient who's very, very sexually aggressive sort of thing. He threatens to rape the nurse at one point, and he's exposing himself. And when they're in a meeting later on, obviously when Jules has been committed, he's kind of just making suggestive sort of signals to her and stuff. And it all leads to Jules, sort of having this worldview where all men are after the same thing. They're only interested in girls for sex. And so we see how she gives herself up to that, the fact that she is sort of very sexually active, and she does go through a lot of guys, and it's all very shallow. But this isn't as effective, as I said, as Kat's flashback last week, and I think the problem with it for me is then it's hitting a very repetitive note. It's hitting this sort of, oh, this is why Jules has turned out like she has sort of note, because everyone's a dick to her, everyone's a slime bag, and all this sort of thing. And as I said, it just gets a bit repetitive. There's only so many times you can do these beats. And I think that is the main issue with this episode, and it's just repeating past things up to the point where it's either with Jules and Rule, their relationship, which, you hope you're going to be sort of invested with. But I mean, that takes us to the fairground, where obviously a lot of stuff happens. The characters are all there, and their plots sort of all revolve around. And again, it's a spectacular sort of thing. It has this very operatic sort of music. It sort of has this quite sly sort of ironic sort of tone to a lot of it. That some of it is satire, like some of the stuff with Nate's dad and the his reputation around town, and this idea about how things are all done for an image type of thing. And we see that with the conversation he has with Christian, and how he's kind of, giving him a tough time, and he gives this preachy sort of pep talk about his football career and the fact he can't afford to be on the bench even for one season. And these scenes have a very interesting sort of tone where they do feel very ironic. They feel sort of staged, and it's sort of making a comment about, I think, the shallowness of people in the town. The fact that a lot of it is a front, a lot of it is done for image, a lot of it is done for status. Again, this very rich sort of affluent sort of thing, because it's mentioned that Nate's father sort of, runs the town by rule, which I think is an exaggeration, but, certainly he's meant to have a lot of power, and he's, sort of running like the whatever it is, beef jerky store, and he sort of talks up the beef jerky basically, and says, because he uses it as a sort of comparison with Christian, and he really worked at making it the best beef jerky in town. And again, it all plays into the ego and sort of masculinity of the whole thing. So, I mean, the fairground scene, which obviously is a continued sort of thing throughout, you don't actually realise it's going to be, then it's going to take up most of the episode. So it's an impressive piece of filming. It's just then what actually happens to the characters and the story and the heart of it just sort of lets it down. And I think that then undercuts the style of the fairground setting because it just becomes shallow in a way. I think it just becomes this thing where it feels like it's showing off more than anything because it doesn't really have the good sort of character moments to go along with it. So I guess commenting on Nate's dad at the beef jerky store. So as I said, he's giving Christian a hard time because of the football, and Christian's there with Cassie, and he hides their relationship sort of thing. You know, he says they're just hanging out, just having a good time. And this obviously pisses Cassie off, so they have a fight. And Christian says, you know, I did it just because if I said we were going out, he would just give me shit sort of thing. And then it's Christian hints at the fact that he knows about Cassie's online stuff. And that's sort of left in the air. He doesn't actually say what he knows, but that causes even more of a gap between them. And I think this is a good example of what I mean about this episode and the characters and just how repetitive they are. So Christian and Cassie, they have another fight as they did in the last episode. And predictably she goes off and she starts flirting with another guy. She finds another guy and gets flirty with him, and they go on like the magic roundabout, and Cassie gets high with Maddie, and I'll talk more about Maddie's plot, but they're both having guys issue. Obviously Maddie having issues with Nate, and then Cassie with Christian. So they both sort of bond and they get high, and that's what part of the thing is. That's what influences Maddie's behaviour at the fairground, and also Cassie. So Cassie goes off with this guy, they go on the magic roundabout, and she literally gets off on the magic roundabout. So she's literally kind of jerking off on the ride sort of thing. So it starts out as this flirtation with this guy and then turns into something else, and she then realises the eyes are sort of on her. And it's just getting too much. And I think, part of the big point of this episode is just how curious these teens are about their boredom, and so then how that leads to extremes in their behaviour sort of thing, and just how mundane and pointless everything all is. I think that's a big sort of tone in the episode. So I mean, a big part of it revolves around Nate's dad, and what basically happens is that Jules points him out to Rule. So they're sort of at the fairground together, and she points out, hey, that's the guy I slept with in the motel. That's the guy I was with. And which I didn't clock, but he's the guy that Jules was with in that. I can't remember whether it was episode 1 or 2. think it was the first episode, but obviously when it was revealed, then she was meeting up with these older guys. So there's a secret there with Mr. Jacobs, and so it again, it's, which I think is a perfectly interesting thing to do. The fact that he's this figurehead of the town, he's this kind of all-American sort of guy, and the image, and that's one of the big things about the show. And yet, he has this seedy, dark side to him. And so that's threatened in this episode. So Rule doesn't really believe Jules, so Jules goes up to the stand and she asks for a beef jerky, and Mr. Jacobs sort of, they're obviously putting on a thing where he obviously pretends not to know her and just goes about serving her, but then she makes a big sort of thing where she kind of, I can't remember exactly what happens, but the sort of thing comes out of her hands, and it's a big thing where she sort of drops it at him, and so it sort of shows him up in public. His son's there, Nate, and it's a really suggestive sort of moment. It sort of flags up then they sort of know each other previously. So this all becomes a big thing with Nate and Jacobs. Mr. Jacobs sort of goes after Jules, and he sort of begs her not to say anything, not to give away their secret, the fact they were together. And she quite casually says, "You don't have to worry, I'm not going to say anything." And again, you sort of wonder if he will. You sort of think, well, you're assuming, I think, for drama, that it's not going, then it's probably going to come out. So she agrees not to, and then in the next instance she gets a text message from Tyler, and Tyler is, of course, is really Nate. So they've been sending messages back and forth. So they agree to meet that night, and obviously Nate knows he knows, and it's Jules. He's been texting. Jules doesn't know the other way. She thinks it's this guy Tyler. And so it sort of ends with Nate they meet, and Jules is obviously surprised. She's repulsed, and she says, "Stay away from me," sort of thing to Nate. But then Nate, he does this thing where it looks as though he's trying to be sensitive. He's trying to say, I'm not the guy you met that night, the night of the party, which was in the first episode. And there's this thing with him where I think they're sort of playing it as he's so unbalanced, then he does sort of believe some of the stuff he's saying, and he is, in his own mind, quite sincere, because he sort of gives her a bit of a talk about how, yes, she's a pretty amazing person, and how she's too good to let her life get messed up. But he's kind of using it as part of a blackmail, so he's obviously cottoned on to the fact that there's something happened between Jules and his father. And then obviously there's this stuff with Nate, which has been going on over text. So he points out, I've got all the images, and he says actually when she's been texting him, she's actually been texting an account which doesn't exist. or at least there's no official owner to the count. So in a way, she doesn't have the evidence on Nate. She can't turn around and say, he's been manipulating me and all this sort of stuff. And again, it's quite a sinister scene because Nate sort of says, the law sort of states that actually, minors can get done for, pornography, sort of for child pornography as well if they're involved. And I don't know if there's truth to that or how that would work, but he's sort of putting the pressure on her, and it's this odd sort of thing. I mean, he's very sort of Patrick Bateman-esque sort of thing, or he has this very sort of disturbed, sort of rich kid type vibe to him, where on the one hand he's manipulating her, but on the other end he's kind of trying to use some sensitivity. He's kind of positioning it as, I'm doing this for you as well, I'm looking out for you, don't mess up your life. And he's piling all these things onto her, like saying, your life would be ruined, but you would struggle to get a job, you could be thrown out of school, people would harass you and all this sort of thing. So that's kind of how it's left with them, and he walks away and is, it's a threat to leave his family alone, sort of thing. And that's when Jules goes back to Rules, and they come back together, they bond, and you actually see them together. So, and I wasn't sure if that was meant to be a dreamlike type thing, but I think you're meant to think that they're now together, sort of thing. But this is part the thing with the series, whether we're going to keep having problems with Rule and Jules. Is it just going to be a forced thing just for drama, or are they actually going to have a bit more of a steady relationship now? Is it going to be more about them than just finding these other subplots to drive a wedge between them? So that's that half of the plot. Obviously, Maddie at the same time is having issues with Nate. As I said, she bonds with Cassie, she gets high, and she reveals to Cassie about the creepy pictures she found on Nate's phone. And so they're sort of bonding. As I said, they both get high, and then she eventually confronts Nate. So it's announced that Nate's father has won, for best beef jerky at the fair. And that's when Maddie decides to cause the scene, and she sort of calls Nate's out, and that's when Nate gets aggressive. He follows her, and he basically, he puts his hands around her throat, squeezes her, and just threatens her. But then she turns the tables because she actually asked the question about the photos. And Nate sort of, he backs off, he sort of gets nervous, and he just says it's too complicated to explain. And he gets emotional and just says he loves her, and they have a moment. But it's interesting with Nate because I'm not sure if the whole Jules thing came about because how much Nate planned it to sort of blackmail Jules. I'm assuming he only had that idea because he realised about the stuff with his father and her. But again, it's all very convenient, the fact that, Nate is doing this thing with Jules, and she happened to sleep with his father. It's all very contrived in a way. So we have a bit more with Kat. She's at the fairground as well, and the guy from school who seems quite into her, seems a nice down to earth guy, quite sensitive. They sort of start hanging out, and things seem to be going quite well, and there's even a flirtation there. But then Kat sees him with another girl, and it's from a distance, so she assumes he's into her, and they're flirting. So that sort of ends that. And I mean, it turns out to be totally innocent. That the girl is just asking him about something like a favour. But Kat gets the wrong idea, so then she goes off and she basically gets with this jerky sort of guy who I think is just running one of the rides or something. And again, it's just so weak. I mean, you could have had something quite interesting happen with Kat and the other guy, and they just whittle it away, and it's just so predictable. She just goes off with this other sort of guy, and obviously we'll see where it leads. Now, I think one of the most interesting things about the episode is the fact that Rule's sister's there, her younger sister, and she's with a friend. And it actually fooled me at first, because I thought then they were supposed to be sort of like younger versions of Rule and Jules. I thought it was doing that sort of like fantasy type sequence where they almost commenting on the older versions of themselves. But I think the reason I felt that is because it's, I didn't realise it was Rule's sister. So I think it is doing a sort of a mirror type thing. And the whole point is that Rule's sister, Jerry, her name is, she's just left to her own devices. Rule is so caught up with Jules and the drama at the fairground than her sister, who she's supposed to be watching, goes off with some jerky guys. Of course they're jerky, because everyone seems to be quite jerky in the show, and she starts getting high. So later Rule goes and finds her and gives her a bit of a talking to, and sort of pulls her away, and they leave, and they have quite a nice moment together on the way home. And it's quite nice because you see that Jules cares about her, and she just says, go straight home and go to your room, go under your covers, I'll sort out Mum, I'll deal with Mum. And she sort of covers for her and doesn't say anything to the mother. And it's just this thing of, will Rule's action impact on her daughter, on her younger sister, sorry. Could Jules' life mirror her, or could Jerry's life mirror Jules? So, I mean, that was quite interesting. It's, again, quite a predictable sort of note, but it's, they did something quite neat there, and there was some sweetness between the sisters. But yeah, this was a really disappointing episode. It really felt like it was spinning the wheels, like it was just getting repetitive. And that stuff was just happening, but wasn't really doing much to progress the characters or the story. It might be, as I said, just a mid-season thing, but this was the first time I really felt it. Like, I felt like this just isn't doing much for me. This is just a bit too soapy. Because the first two episodes I was really positive on, and then the last episode I was less positive on, but there was still really good stuff. And I think this one, just because it was mostly all set at the fairground, and it had this, again, a lot of style, but because a lot of the character beats weren't really matching it, they weren't really making these sharp sort of observational points the way they had done previously, then I think that does make it seem like style over substance sort of thing. But hopefully it'll pull it back in the next episode and the rest of the season. But not great. Not a great episode in my opinion. But if you have a different view, if you really like this episode, or you want to comment on anything I'm saying, then please chip in the comments below. But this has been my latest Euphoria review, and as I said, I should be back up to speed and have the next review up late Tuesday, early Wednesday. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you guys again soon.